Hello, I'm Mike Snow, and right here you're looking at my bullet point mind map for DevSecOps. This page is put together more for a presentation material that is not PowerPoint. I'm not a fan of PowerPoint, so instead I use this page when I'm having conversations with people about DevSecOps. Now, a little bit more about me. I've been a software developer for over 20 years. Approximately 7 or 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I started to hear word of this thing called DevOps. And it was really difficult for me to really understand what it meant. Like I heard people talking about, oh, it's automation, or oh, it's this or it's that, or if you're doing agile, you're doing DevOps, and yada, yada, yada. It didn't feel right to me. And so I spent a lot of time reading and studying and trying to really understand the roots of DevOps and why it was such a significant force in my profession, software development. And so after years of reading and studying and hunting, I came to the understanding that DevOps is really a philosophy that incorporates an entire organization. So it's top to bottom, left to right. Everybody needs to be a member of the DevOps team, whether you're marketing or you're engineering or whatever. That aside, this little mind map that I put together helps to advise my conversation when I'm talking to people. I'm not really a fan of PowerPoint. I think it's a horrible tool. I think it's a crutch that is very distracting from the topic at hand. And so I'm starting to surface this page to people. I put it in my resume. I've sent it to people. So I figure I would make a video, a really hopefully quick video, no promises, of just some really high level discussion of what this is, just so you can kind of understand what you're seeing, or at least understand the reason for its existence. So this mind map is written using D3. So D3 is a JavaScript thing. It's really for kind of a UI fancy sauce kind of stuff. I'm not a UI developer by any stretch of the imagination, but I just put this together as a single page file. So if you look at the source code, you see everything is in this single HTML file. The main reason for that is this is actually hosted in an Azure storage account. So it's not really a web server. It's not a CDN. It's just a plain old storage account that's serving up HTTP requests. There's nothing secure here, so I didn't bother buying a certificate, putting HTTPS, because there's literally nothing secure. This is completely open. It's just basically a text file that you can click through. I want to call attention to the fact that you can hover over these labels. So when you hover over the label, you can read a bit more about the specific thing. And so this is really not designed to be read like a blog or a full article. This is meant to be kind of, you weave through it and you hover over the things and you read about it and you think about it. I think pondering and reflection is huge when it comes to understanding DevOps. So take time, hover through, expand this tree out, hover over things, just read it and think about it and kind of reflect on what it means and how it docks into your understanding of DevOps, just for fun. So I can just zip through here real quick. I'll try to not go down different alleyways and go into my full spiel because it could take forever. So in my mind, DevOps or DevSecOps, and the reason why I think those are interchangeable is because security in my mind is not an option. If, as an engineer, you have an inherent responsibility to produce secure code, secure products, absolutely. You're protecting your customer, you're protecting your business. You really have an absolute obligation to be security minded. So to me, DevOps, DevSecOps, synonymous. Security is not an option. So that aside, this breaks up into, I've broken this up into kind of 3 channels of thought. It doesn't mean that you pick and choose. It doesn't mean that they live in isolation or even that these certain bullet points can't belong to something else in this mind map. what I'm trying to do is create these channels of thought so it's easier to put context around these topics as you look at it. You could easily move these things around. It doesn't really matter. So the three channels of thought, or the three things or thought patterns that I think really comprise DevOps is what I'm calling flow, feedback, and improvement. So flow is really all about how work moves through the system, how work flows through the system. So how do you deliver value? Feedback is how does information flow back into the system for growth and change and improvement. And then improvement is what I'm thinking of as the culture that wraps up the entirety of the DevOps organization. May not be the best words. That's just kind of how I think about it in my head. So flow is work going through the system. Feedback is information coming back into the system. And improvement is a cultural thing that encompasses how you refine and improve your DevOps practices in general. So expand into flow, we're talking about agile. So I'm sure everybody who is looking at this video or looking at the site understands what agile is, at least to some extent. And then, being lean is about also utilizing your resources to maximize value. So if you think about, let's say you're trying to build something that's worth $100, but it costs you $99 to build that thing, what you're delivering is $1 of value. So being lean is about cutting out the waste and cutting out unnecessary work cycles or whatever it is to reduce the cost of delivering value so that you can realize more value. So if you have something that's $100 that you're trying to deliver and it costs you, say, $20 to make it, then it's $80 of value. So being lean, it goes hand in hand with work delivery. A few key points that I want to talk about or just really quickly zip through in terms of Agile. I'll try not to go down these rabbit holes of stuff I've seen in terms of what was wrong. I'll just kind of talk about these in isolation. So self-organizing means that you want to have a team that has autonomy, that can build their sprint backlog and determine what they're going to be doing for the next X number of weeks, whatever your time box is for your sprint. So that you need to give the team that autonomy. Clear standards for creating user stories. The last thing you want to do is commit to delivering a user story, have it in your sprint, and then realize you don't really know what they're asking for. And now you've committed to it. You've committed to deliver this within the time frame, and you may completely blow the sprint. So you really want to have clear standards for user story creation and make sure that those are clear so you're not finding yourself in that situation. Sizing user stories is important to some extent. Like you don't want to commit to delivering the moon when you only have X number of weeks to do it. So if a story is really big, you need to have a consciousness or understanding how that impacts your ability to deliver or commit to deliver. So properly sizing user stories is about having that consciousness and breaking stories down into pieces that are digestible and deliverable within a committed time window. That feeds into properly sized sprints. So a sprint is a body of work that you've committed to deliver within a certain amount of time. This is important. If you can't deliver your sprint, if you can't deliver on your commitments in the time specified, it really impacts your ability to project when you're going to be able to get to feature X or when you're going to be able to deliver this thing. So properly sized sprints helps you tune your team to understand how much work can be delivered within a certain amount of time. And that really has meaning. Like I've seen places, now here I go, I'm talking about something I've seen before, but I've seen places that would way overload the sprint. They would commit to a month's worth of work and say they can deliver it in 2 weeks. And they were constantly blowing the sprint. They were never done at the end of the sprint. And what that does is create a culture of failure in my mind. You're failing to deliver on your commitments. A sprint is a commitment to deliver everything that's in that sprint. And so if you are not delivering what you've committed to deliver to, it really doesn't have much meaning to you or the customer. So make sure that you're properly sizing commits or your sprints based on what your team can reasonably deliver in the time window. See, here's one: rapid adjustment to feedback. This is a feedback thing, but it's also an agile thing. So really what this means is, and here another example, I've seen teams that have pre-built sprints months in advance. Like they're working on sprint number 1 and sprint number 2 is already queued up with the work. Well, what happens if you blow your sprint number 1? That has to push into sprint number 2, which pushes sprint number 3. What happens if some feedback comes back and you need to adjust, and now the stuff that you've specified in sprint number 2 is no longer relevant? So being able to rapidly adjust to feedback means you don't do that pre-planning. You don't plan sprints in advance, ever. You just plan your sprint, you incorporate the feedback, which will advise your next sprint, and so on and so forth. The theme here, you can see I'm really hammering on the importance of getting the sprint completed. What you commit to is what you deliver. And so when you say that this amount of work is going to get delivered in this amount of time, that's a commitment, and it's a commitment of the team. So let's say you have 5 team members. 3 of the team members have finished the work items that they've committed to. There's no additional work items in the backlog, the sprint backlog, but there are a couple that are being worked on by a couple team members. What do you do if you have no more work for yourself? So swarming on tasks mean that the importance of finishing what you've committed to in the sprint is so important that you would take the resources that are free and you would pile them into the work that hasn't been completed yet. So swarming on tasks means that as people complete their work and the sprint gets smaller, more resources go onto the remaining tasks, because we have to get those done. We have to deliver what we've committed to in the sprint. So swarming is important. Where conversely, you wouldn't want someone to go working on, let's say, a feature that's going to be in the next sprint or some other thing. You really want them to stay focused in that sprint until it is done. Now, if you're done a week ahead of time, you're not sizing your sprints right. And so that kind of advises that too. Excuse me. Quality over quantity. We have to get out of the mindset that a lot of completed work is the goal. You don't want to be looking at solely delivering 20 user stories. We finished 20 user stories. What a great thing. What's the quality of that? If you're churning out a lot of work that's low quality, it's going to wind up burning you in the form of technical debt. So you really want to make sure that you're building quality into the system by taking your time, making sure that the due diligence is done, and you're not propagating technical debt into your delivered product, because that's just going to devalue what you're delivering. Now, I've seen a lot of teams. I can't help but go into things that I've seen where I've seen teams do retros kind of as this rote process. They go and, what's good, bad, and ugly. They talk about issues. They talk about what they should improve. And then that's it. That's the end. They don't talk about it again. It does nothing to the next sprint. It's just this thing that lives in isolation and has no value. Since we want to maximize value and cut out waste, the retros need to be providing value. Otherwise, what's the point? So having actionable retros means that when you do find something problematic, or you do set goals as a team, you are conscious and aware of that, and people are actively working on it and measuring progress to resolve those things. So actionable retros are important over just the rote process of doing the retro. It actually needs to have value. Pulling work through the system. Sometimes you see the sprint backlog is built, people go through and say, hey, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, they're going to do that. And as soon as the sprint starts, all the work's assigned. That's kind of a wrong thing to do. So let's say 3 things are assigned to someone and then they get sick, or, something happens and they're not able to do it. The mindset that happens, kind of a human thing, is someone sees that the ticket's already assigned to someone and they don't touch it. I'm not going to touch that. That belongs to so-and-so and they're out. So, we can't do anything until they're back. Pulling work through the system means that your sprint backlog is always unassigned until you're actually actively working on it. And so what this does is prevent that gap, prevent someone taking ownership of something, ahead of time and then not being able to do it, or they're not available. And what goes along with pulling work through the system is, hopefully when you're building your sprint backlog, that's in priority order. Like, how to prioritize things. And so item number 1 is top priority, second priority. And so when someone comes along and they're looking for something to do, it's not just pick and choose. You pull it from the top of the list and you start working on it. And people will come and say, well, what if I don't know that? That's going to slow us down. That's not good, right? If you think of it very basically, no, that's not good. It slows you down. If you think about it in terms of mitigating risk, it is actually good, because what happens when someone pulls a ticket or work item that they're not super familiar with, it means that they're going to have to learn. They're going to have to understand and learn and dig, and that comes into quality over quantity. And so if you can level those skills and distribute that knowledge across the team, you mitigate risk. Instead of, the expert of this thing always taking this thing as tickets and isolating that expertise to this one person, you kind of force people to take things that they're not so comfortable with and collaborate with those people that are comfortable with those things. And so over time, as you build this behavior, your team starts becoming more knowledgeable in general. And so you don't have these pillars of expertise that really create risk. You really are at risk when you have only a few people knowing a lot of the stuff. And so that goes along with pulling work through the system. So you're not just pulling willy-nilly, you're pulling from the top of the list. And I kind of wandered a little bit into a couple different things, but that's sort of what I think about when I think about pulling work through the system is, you don't assign it until you're actually working on it. And when you do pull work from the system, you're pulling from the top of the list based on priority. Of course, communication. Communication is very, very important. Extremely important. It's can't be overstated, the importance of keeping close connection with stakeholders. You want to make sure that you guys are both speaking the same language. It is so easy for someone to say something or write something and someone to read that and completely look at it differently. So going to the customer, going to the requester and just, hey, I'm working on this, just letting you know, this is how it's going. This is my understanding. I know there's kind of this philosophy that engineering is sort of like this, they kind of sit in the cave and they don't talk to anybody. They don't look at the sun or, they stay in the dark. This is trying to get past that and trying to encourage communication and collaboration and making sure that we aren't going to produce something that the customer didn't really want. And so we're trying to avoid those communication breakdowns by having a lot of communication with the stakeholder, directly from dev to stakeholder, have the communication there. It can really mitigate a lot of problems that can come out of miscommunication. And this final thing, deliver working software frequently. And there's a whole paradigm around that. Talk about continuous delivery, continuous integration, and trunk-based development. This is really the key of Agile, I think, is delivering things frequently, putting the product in the hands of the customer as soon as possible so you can start getting that feedback. If you're doing slow deployments, let's say you're deploying changes once a month or once every few months or once a year or whatever, there's much greater risk of having to go back and redo things way later after you're no longer thinking about it. So then you need to go in and, remember what it was doing, have those conversations again. It's just a lot of wasted time. So if you can catch problems early, you can prevent, problems built on top of problems built on top of problems. So delivering working software frequently is really, really important. So that there's a whole other paradigm there that I'm not going to go into, but I'll just say that's really important. And that's kind of the agile piece. The lean piece, there's a whole philosophy around lean. It's a whole profession. There's a whole bunch of things that you can learn about lean software development. And the top bullet here really, it summarizes the whole thing. You eliminate waste. So you really want to scrutinize what you're doing. The meetings you're having, the disconnects between communication, like you really want to dial into those things that are not delivering value to your customer. If it's not delivering value, it needs to be eliminated. We need to cut down on the cost to maximize what we're delivering. Building quality in. I think I talked about this a little while ago. If you are delivering things that are not quite right, you're putting technical debt into the system. And so technical debt, you are going to have to go back and address that technical debt. And like with any other debt, there's an interest rate. The longer it's out there, the more you have, the more it's going to cost you to eventually you get to a point where you're spending more time firefighting than you are delivering value. And so it's really critically important that you have the quality mindset to do it right the first time and don't deliver poor code or poor products. Not allowing yourself to do that. And I know sometimes we deal with fire situations. Something's on fire. We absolutely have to get this out. We've got a downline. We got a customer. This is a philosophy. This isn't like, hey, this is how it's going to be and this is how it's always going to be. This is something to work towards. So that's the kind of the philosophical part of this is you really want to ensure everything you are delivering is the best quality. I'm not saying that's always possible. We live in reality, have to temper things to reality, but this is something that we should always be working towards. Another element is creating knowledge. So I was talking a little while ago about pulling work through the system or people pulling in work that they're not so familiar with. Creating knowledge means that there's less dependence on one particular person, which means your bandwidth opens up. More people can work on more things without bottlenecks. So creating knowledge and having a environment where people can learn is really lean because you're cutting down on the time it takes to deliver things. Deferring commitment sounds funny. It's kind of saying, don't think of it as just telling people, no, I'm not going to do that. What this is doing is this kind of relates to where I was talking earlier of having clear standards for creating user stories and tasks. So deferring commitment means that if someone's requesting something and it's not clear the value proposition or it's not clear what really they're wanting, saying, no, hold on, stop, we're not going to work on that until it's clear, until the value is clear, that's actually a good thing. Because what happens if you start working on something that's not clear or the value proposition isn't really clear, you're going to spend a lot of time, which may result in nothing, which is waste. So being lean means you want to work on those things that actually deliver actual value. So you don't want to be working on some pet project or something that hasn't embedded or whatever. So deferring commitment just means that you're gonna hold on accepting work until it's clear. Delivering fast. A lot of this are kind of parallel with Agile. This is sort of a reiteration. You want to deliver fast because the faster you can deliver, the faster you can get feedback and the faster you can fix problems before they compound. So you think about building something fundamental and then building something that relies on that and something that relies on that, and then finding out that that fundamental thing was wrong. Now you have all this stuff on top of it that also needs to be fixed. So delivering fast means that you get the feedback faster and prevent that from happening, which is lean. Respecting people. You must have a culture of safety and respect. You cannot have a healthy team that delivers that is fearful to talk, fearful to work, fearful to raise issues. When you have an environment where people are afraid to call out problems, those problems propagate into the system and wind up causing problems down the line where we're having to do rework. So respect and a psychologically safe environment is really critical if you want to cut out waste, because inherently someone's going to see something, and if they don't say something, that problem is going to make its way into the system, and eventually it's going to be found in a bad way, by way of an outage or improper delivery or something. So psychological safety is really a tenet of being lean. And optimizing the whole talks about not just looking at one process or one thing and looking to optimize things in isolation. You need to look at the entire system. So there's something called value stream mapping. So if you map out how things work through the system and you find those pieces and parts that are not optimized, you want to dial into that. So even if it's outside of engineering, let's say there's a QA or there's someone somewhere is causing a bottleneck, that's part of the whole. And so if you're just optimizing things in isolation, like in development or engineering, and you're not looking at the entire end-to-end process, you're missing something. And so you want to optimize the whole. Yesterday, in the middle of my recording, I received a phone call. So I cut my recording short, and I am picking up where I left off today. So I think I was talking about flow. We just wrapped up flow. Getting into the feedback track here in the mind map. So if flow is work going out, being delivered, feedback is information coming back in based on the value that is being delivered. So I think when you start digging into DevOps, you'll hear a lot about feedback loops, almost exclusively feedback loops. Feedback loops are really a discipline in and of themselves. I would consider them to be concrete tools or processes that you can use to facilitate improvement. So there's really two types of loops that we're talking about. Reinforcing loops, which involve kind of unbounded growth. So trying to improve continuously. Then the next one is balancing loops. So balancing loops is a method that you can use to get to some desired state. So talking about reinforcing loops. So the idea here is you do work, you deliver work, you get feedback, it comes back into the work pipeline, and you get improvement. And, the idea is it just continues. You continue to deliver and it continues to improve. When that cycle is happening, when you have the improvement happening, that's considered a virtuous cycle. That's something good. Conversely, you can get bad feedback, or something bad can make its way into that communication loop. And when that happens, things start to degrade, and that's considered a vicious cycle. So watch out for that occurring. So there's kind of some caveats to both of these. With a virtuous cycle, growth is good, but you have to acknowledge that growth is not infinite. There's going to be at some point the law of diminishing returns coming into play, where you simply can't get anything more based on what you're investing into it. So the idea here is to be mindful of the limits of growth and start to anticipate those limits so you can head them off at the pass or address them early on before you wind up investing a lot of time and money or resources into something that's not going to deliver the results desired. Now with the vicious cycle, where something bad is happening, there's some bad information or some bad communication or something bad is happening in your reinforcing loop, When this happens, you really want to identify the thing that is causing that problem and break that loop, either stop that communication or change the methods being used to factor in those information pieces or whatever. The key with the vicious cycle is breaking the cycle. With reinforcing, it's about growth, where balancing is about hitting a specified target or desired state. So this involves, defining what the desired state is going to be, not just kind of thinking about it, but it really involves a team and everyone involved to come to a consensus what the desired state should be. And once you have the desired state defined, then you can start looking at current state. So you articulate current state, be honest, identify the problems, what's wrong, where are we currently, and how is that in respect to the desired state. And so the gap between current state and desired state represents the effort that needs to be made to bring current state to desired state. And so with that defined, you start working on it. You start, iterating and working on moving from current state to desired state. And you really need to commit to making that happen. Because what typically happens, or what we find happening in this kind of a thing, is as we move closer to desired state, the motivation starts to drop off because we get closer and closer to what we're trying to achieve. And the perception of priority seems to lessen. And so the commitment to completion is really important. If the desired state is important, committing to actually pushing it across the finish line is important. Now, let's say you get to your desired state, everything is done. Another thing that you need to be thinking about is there was a reason for you to be in that problematic state to begin with. So nothing really lives in isolation. So the system that you've worked really hard to get into the desired state is going to have external actors, external influences. So to prevent you from sliding back away out of your desired state back into that articulated current state, you need to look outside of that system as a whole and figure out why were you in that current state to begin with. And so to mitigate failure, to mitigate backsliding, you really need to invest the effort to understand those outside influences or outside actors that could risk sliding back into a not so great state. And so feedback loops is a formal discipline. There's formal training around that. I also think of other things that get fed back into the work stream, that being what I call current state. So when I think current state, I think what is the current state of the ecosystem that's running your value. So your software, your services, all those things that represent the current state of your system. And to be mindful of current state by getting data and information about that current state by way of telemetry, or having like an observability strategy where you get metrics and data and logging out of your running systems. And then from that telemetry, that information, having it's great, but if something bad happens, knowing that something bad is happening as soon as possible is important. And so you build in alerts or monitors to alert people when something is not right or something is down or broken. I'd say the alerting strategy is important to get right because alerting impacts real people. So you have an on-call schedule, people get the alerts and they address the problem. Now, if your alerts are noisy or pointless or just, hey, informative, just want to let you know that something's happening. Yeah, we don't really want to wake people up at 2:00 in the morning for stuff like that. So make sure your alerts are always actionable and always critical. That means that they always need to be always think of your alerts going off at 2 o'clock in the morning. If it doesn't need to be solved at 2 o'clock in the morning, it probably shouldn't be alert. It should be an email or some other delayed system of notification. So trunk-based development it kind of goes part and parcel with continuous delivery. You see, I have it down here a little bit. Trunk-based development is really about shortening the cycles of getting code changes into your master code branch. So the idea here is if you're pushing code more often into your code branch, you're more likely to find problems in your code quicker, assuming that you have continuous integration and automated testing and things like that in place. So when you do trunk-based development, the idea is it's a smaller change, hopefully, and the person or the developers that are working on that code already have the problem set in their mind. What they've done is fresh, and so when they run into a problem, they are able to quickly address the problem or can get to it quicker instead of having to go back and remember what they did. So trunk-based development shortens the time from code to pushing code into your main branch. And so I kind of consider that to be feedback. This is information going back to the developers or developer to address issues quicker. Similar to telemetry, continuous testing is kind of a form of telemetry where you are sending canaries into the coal mine, so to speak. So you have a system up and running. Let's say it's complex. Let's say it's composed of microservices, and it's really difficult to know if something's wrong. It's just the complexity is just too high. So by implementing continuous testing, you are sending canaries into the coal mine based on known good criteria to see end to end. Is this workflow working end to end? And if it's not, then the continuous testing would feed into your telemetry and your alerting to let people know there's a problem before your customer lets you know. I don't think anybody wants to be told about problems by way of the customer. We want to know first. So continuous testing is another stream of feedback, kind of part and parcel to telemetry. Continuous integration. This goes hand in hand with trunk-based development. So when you're checking in code, you just don't want to check it in and let it sit there. When the check-in or the commit happens, or the merge happens, you want to then run your continuous integration. So you want to build your system, run the automated tests to verify that things are working, at least from that automated test level. So continuous integration is important to complement trunk-based development. So you're finding those problems early. Continuous delivery, there's a whole really laundry list of things that go along with continuous delivery that need to happen. Trunk-based is part of it. Continuous integration is part of it. Automated testing is part of it. The idea here is you're wanting to get the work into the hands of the customer as fast as possible. That doesn't mean that you make a change and the change shows up in production and now the change is live and impacting things. So along with continuous delivery, you probably want to implement like a feature flagging capability so you're launching dark. The real key is that no matter what goes into the master branch, it is in a deployable state at all times. So you can merge your code in, it goes through the gate checks, and it winds up in production, and no one knows. Now, if you can feature flag and turn that stuff on and off, super awesome, super safe. That's a whole other topic for discussion. So yeah, that's current state. Just kind of looking at your ecosystem, understanding where you are currently, and how things are running, and if anything is going wrong. That all that information feeds in, sort of as feedback, live, real-time feedback, so to speak. So discovery, I think this is kind of a big one. And if you read about the Toyota production system or Toyota in general, they have this methodology or this ideology where you don't necessarily want to rely completely on what the customer is telling you. Meaning maybe they've gotten really well adjusted to a dysfunctional system. And so they're telling you things in context of that dysfunction. So the discovery piece here, the feedback that you're trying to get out of this is going to the customer and actually sitting with them and watching them as they work through the system to understand how they're getting their job done, and if they're doing things that, you know, they've got really well adjusted to, but it's dysfunctional and there's a way to address it so much better. So if you read the book about Toyota, the Toyota production system, this is called Genchi Gambutsu. And this is all about going to where your customer is and watching them work and observing their struggles and kind of putting fresh perspective around what they're trying to accomplish. This will really help you solidify relationships with your customer, and it will help bring about better change, maybe necessary change that they didn't even acknowledge or realize was necessary. And so that's another piece that I'm considering feedback. This is information that's coming into, into your shop or into your organization to help facilitate your customers' needs better, more effectively. The final leg here are something called DORA metrics. So the DORA metrics there's a DevOps research and assessment group that goes and surveys organizations that are trying to implement DevOps or working on the DevOps philosophy and trying to get there. And so what they do is, they measure what they're doing, how they're doing things, trying to figure out, what differentiates those companies that are just like unicorns and having amazing success versus companies that may be struggling a little bit. And so the DORA metrics is a way to measure your own progress as an organization as you work through implementing DevOps, kind of in a concrete way, at least according to this methodology, where they have identified these 4 key metrics that are really indicative of success when trying to do the DevOps philosophy. So the first one here is cycle time. What it's looking at is how much time does it take to go from when you start working on an item to the point where it's actually delivered. And so what we don't want to misconstrue there is time that an item sits in the backlog. So if an item sits in the backlog, it may sit there for a while where some additional research or conversations need to happen. That's really kind of nebulous and difficult to quantify. Where cycle time really looks at, okay, the item is in the sprint, you said go, I'm working on it, how long does it take to finish it, and how much time does it take for it to actually be in production? Deployment frequency looks at the number of deployments that you have. So how mature is your CI/CD pipeline? How often can you get changes out into production? Of course, the shorter the deployment frequency, the more successful typically companies are. I know sometimes that gives people heartburn. There's a lot of fear around change, and that's kind of indicative of other systematic issues that might need to be addressed. Mean time to restore is all about how long does it take for issues, once identified, to be fixed. How long does it take to recover from system outages? So that's all about responsiveness, infrastructure, when we're talking about disaster recovery, all of that. So how mature is your system in general? How easy is it for you to revert back problematic changes or issues or whatever? And then finally, the change failure rate is looking at how often do changes that get pushed into your code base or pushed into your system, how often do those changes result in failures or outages or problems? And so what that's really trying to measure is how mature is your testing and your QA, and how are you doing with your stories? Are things clear? So on and so forth. So changes that are getting pushed into the system, how often are those breaking things? And so that's another key measurement. So with all of these measurements, you really want them to be small. So you want short cycle time. You want short time between deployments. You want short mean time to restore. You want short change, few change failures. So that's really what the driving force is behind these metrics, and they're based on empirical evidence and data. These metrics seem to be the most meaningful. So when you're looking to measure things in order to gauge your success of implementing your processes, these are really the key ones that seem to be indicative of a successful DevOps organization. And that's kind of feedback in a nutshell. There's a lot more that can be said about it. Communication is huge, and getting information into the system is huge. You can't have clear enough communication. It's very easy to misconstrue things. So really putting a lot of emphasis on feedback is important. So the final item here is improvement. And so I think when people hear improvement, they think, oh, we're going to improve concrete processes. We're going to make, Scrum better, Scrum more efficient. We're going to make documentation better and more efficient. We're going to do these things, these concrete things, like it's prescriptive. And the way I look at improvement is really an all-encompassing ideology that basically forms your culture as a company. Improvement sort of wraps around everything and everyone. So since DevOps is a philosophy, it's something that we have to continuously strive for in order to be honest with ourselves and honest with our customers. We have to identify things that need to be improved and actually improve them. And so stepping into improvement, it's not all about process improvement. It's also about what is needed to facilitate improvement as a whole. So starting off here at the top, kind of the key concept that I think about is culture. So culture being, when you look through DevOps, you look through the things that are required, sometimes it's counterintuitive. Sometimes DevOps is saying, maybe you need to slow down a little bit. Maybe you need to not deliver so much. Maybe you need to do certain things that from the surface looks like a bad thing, or something that's more expensive, or something that's going to take a lot of time. And so it's really hypercritical that if you're pursuing DevOps and you're pursuing the idea of being an elite organization, you really need a supportive and engaged leadership. They really have to be bought in and supportive of pursuing these things, even though on the surface they may seem counterintuitive. Implementing a quality mindset has to be across the board. Oftentimes you run into situations where it's all about delivery, getting this thing done, being done with it, pushing it out the door, and then dealing with the problems later. Of course, sometimes that's the reality of things. Sometimes you're obligated contractually, or there's some financial incentive or whatever. But again, this is something that we're striving towards. So the quality mindset is really not wanting to produce technical debt or problems or introduce issues into the system if it's at all possible to not do that. Governance is sometimes a dirty word. Sometimes people think of governance as overreach or kind of unpleasant controls, but really proper, light touch, but meaningful governance can also help us keep from blowing our foot off. And it helps advise quality and helps advise consistency. And so governance, having proper, well-articulated, adhered to governance is really a benefit to us all. And so making governance an important thing that needs to happen as a foundational thing that we lay down before we start doing other things can really help improve the whole. Another important part of culture is everyone feeling involved, everyone feeling ownership of what's happening. So you want people to feel engaged and feel excited and kind of buy into the shared vision or the goals that the company is trying to work towards. So you really want people to have that energy and that excitement. And we do that by making them have ownership and buy-in and feel like they're a part of the decisions and, their voice matters. And so talking about that in that same vein, you want continuous suggestion sharing. So anytime anyone sees anything that's a problem, they should not feel, afraid or intimidated, where they keep that to themselves. We really want to encourage people to be open and, put their ideas out there and give them a platform or a mechanism where they can share that freely without judgment. And so, implementing continuous suggestion sharing is just that. So we want to always hear people's feedback. We always want to question ourselves and question our processes and let people do that without fear of retribution. Transparency. Being able to make suggestions is only possible if people have transparency into processes and data and what's happening. And so all of these are kind of playing off each other. So you think of a company that goes and makes decisions behind closed doors and then unleashes it for people with the mandate of, you will do this no matter what. People need to have transparency into the why behind mandates. So if there are mandates and people have to do it, there needs to be transparency of why. Maybe there's something that was missed, or maybe there's something or a better way to do things. So having that transparency gives people the opportunity to understand deeper what's being asked of them. Continuous feedback. These are a little bit duplicative. Kind of where we were talking about continuous suggestion sharing. Continuous feedback is sort of in that same vein where, we really want to welcome people to talk about how things are going, their perspective. No one knows better about the effectiveness of a process as someone who's actually in the trenches working with that process every day. And so that continuous feedback is worth gold. If they are finding something awkward or something that is slow or not delivering the desired value, listening to that feedback and adjusting to that feedback is important if we want to keep moving the chain down the field. Or I guess you would say, I was thinking about continuous suggestion sharing. I guess how that differentiates is if someone has a different idea or a different innovation. We don't want to stifle those ideas. So I suppose that's how it would differ between continuous suggestion sharing and continuous feedback, where feedback would be information on what is, and continuous suggestion sharing could be information on what could be. Developing a shared vision is hypercritical. You really want all oars in the water rowing in the same direction. So if you've read a book, there's a book called Measure What Matters, and they really talk about defining OKRs and defining consistency such that you have everyone working in the same goal. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to have your resources doing different things and pushing towards different directions. If you think of a system as a whole, you have chaos inside. You're not going to make a lot of progress towards the goal for the company. So developing a shared vision or a shared goal really helps everyone align their efforts and their thinking and understand what we're trying to accomplish as an organization. So there's no reason to keep that as proprietary closed information. Be open and share the vision, make sure everyone's in line, and make sure everyone understands why, so everyone can unify behind that and all put effort in that direction. And the final thing here is psychological safety. I think I've talked about this several times. For all of this to happen, people have to feel safe. They have to feel like they can raise a concern, or they can make a suggestion, or they can call out something that's actually outright problematic, and not fear that they're going to be shot down or not listened to, or whatever. We really want people to have that buy-in and the ownership as part of the organization. So we don't want them to be, oh, you're just a dev, you don't really understand. You really want to take their feedback and their perspective seriously. And if they don't understand something, maybe it means that there's not transparency, or there's not clear communication, or the vision's unclear. So every problem is indicative of a problem somewhere else. So psychological safety is really important in terms of fostering that growing, unified kind of culture. I couldn't go through this without talking about Toyota Kata. So explicitly improvement, and we talked about this a little bit with the feedback loops, um, specifically the balancing loop. So balancing loop is about setting a goal and what it takes to get that goal. I think the Toyota Kata is more of an articulated way of doing that in a more concrete way. So this looks very similar to the balancing loop. So you understand the direction or the end state that you want to get to, the desired state. You understand the current state, and then you set goals or incremental goals you iterate on to go from current state to desired state. So Toyota Kata is more of a full-featured set of information or practices around that process that I think is kind of feeding off of the balancing loop in terms of feedback loop. So they have within there, you'll see that there's this plan, do, check, and act cycle. So you plan, what are you going to do? You actually do it. You check the progress, and then you take action on the progress, meaning you plan again, you do again, you check again, you act again. And so it's this continuous cycle that this is typically kind of a coaching thing. So you would coach people to set goals and help them achieve those goals, which benefits the person, it benefits the organization. So Toyota Kata is sort of a more articulate, a more concrete way of approaching improvement from an individual level. And overall, all of this takes commitment. That's kind of my wrap-up statement. You can see I'm getting a little hoarse and a little tired just talking about the high-level bullets of what I perceive to be part of DevOps or DevSecOps. And a lot of it from a classical or kind of an older mindset seems very counter to a lot of things that people may be accustomed to. And so commitment is kind of saying, yeah, we agree, we're going to do this. And even though it feels funny or I don't feel super comfortable with it, committing to it and seeing it through to completion. And that means commitment from leadership for funding, commitment from individuals to really reflect and improve themselves and understand themselves and kind of, step outside their comfort zone a little bit, and try and to improve overall their approach to things, and overall commitment to stay the course. Because sometimes this is going to get hard and sometimes it's going to get worse before it gets better. Particularly if you are falling behind on some of these things. So like if you're a waterfall shop, or if you don't have continuous delivery, or you don't have observability strategy, or whatever the problem is, some of these things can be really heavy lifts and really uncomfortable, and it can make it feel like you're going in reverse. But the commitment, once you commit, you need to hold that line and really resolve to seeing it through till you start realizing the benefit from it. It might take some time, but definitely this is a path of success. This is a proven, quantifiable methodology or paradigm or philosophy that, when taken seriously and pursued in earnest, really does deliver results, and it differentiates between these elite organizations and these other organizations that eventually kind of get left in the dust. So that's kind of the summary of this. Probably not the best. I kind of shot from the hip a lot. A bit of a dry throat today, so I'm drinking some water. But I appreciate you. If you stayed through the end and watched this, I really appreciate your commitment and your interest in this. This is something that I really take to heart. I think this is really the path for delivering absolute value and squeezing as much juice as you can out of what you're doing. Excuse me. And it's something that I fully have committed to in terms of my approach, or how I kind of reflect on my day. How am I doing towards these things, and how can I do better, and what can we do to move more towards this goal? One thing that kind of dawned on me, I talked a little bit about security, how security is fundamental to all things. If you're an engineer, you need to be security minded. A couple things that didn't make its way into this mind map specifically is the idea of left shift. So left shifting security, left shifting QA, things like that. The big one here in regard to security is left shifting security. So this is kind of out of band, not in this mind map, but I really want to emphasize the importance of involving security from the get-go. So if you think about, if you're building a car, and let's say you build this car, it rolls off the assembly line, and here it is. That's a really bad point to stress test the individual parts. Just like security, you don't want to roll out your product, and at the end, when you're about to click the deliver button or whatever, then ask security to look at it, because that's much more difficult problem set. If you incorporate security as part of your team and they are involved throughout the build of the product, they're involved in the PR or the pull request reviews, and they're involved in stress testing as things get built, then the testing is done. When the product is done, the security is done, and it's all been done in line throughout the creation of this thing. And so left shifting security is just that. You're shifting security to the left to be in line or in sync with the development process. So it happens at the same time development is happening and decisions are happening. So really that's something that I feel like I left out of this, probably not on purpose. It just didn't seem to make its way in here, but I really wanted to call that out. Left shift security, left shift QA, as you're building stuff, you're testing stuff, both for quality and for security. And, it's much easier to do it as you're doing it instead of waiting to the end and having a much bigger, much more complex problem set that may ultimately have to be torn apart because of maybe security issues or QA issues. So be mindful of left shift. If I was to think about it, I'd probably say left shift belongs in flow because it's part of delivery. So left shifting security, left shifting QA would probably be in flow. So that's it. Hopefully you found this video useful. This is something that's really important to me, and thank you. Let me know, reach out to me, and if you have any questions. Thanks.